Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for What's at Stake, the second part of our nonpartisan conversation about this 2020 election and what an election it was. We will hear more thoughts from our guest speakers on that. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Max Potashnik. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Government Affairs work at the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, and it's my pleasure to be in conversation with our guest speakers, Rabbi Kahn and Jessyn Farrell, on this. Again, I think it's a rainy afternoon. I was looking at my notes from October 19th and the rain is starting again. So, and that's a good transition to those of you. Thank you who were able to join us on October 19th, but please, for those of you who this is your first time joining us, do not fear, you will not be lost in this conversation. It will still be relevant and interesting. So just a quick recap for those of you who don't know, every time there's a big election, really every other year in these even numbered years where we have a big election, the Federation does quite a bit of nonpartisan voter engagement work. We have a candidate survey that we put out to state legislators. We do a fun event called Voting in Vino where folks learn about ballot measures and get a chance to meet candidates. And this year we had quite a robust set of resources, debates, and all kinds of things on our website for the 2020 election. So if you haven't had a chance to check some of those out, they're still up on our website for a bit longer. I did also want to share that we're planning to do an event the second week in December 14th, 15th, or 16th to talk more about the results of our Jewish Community Public Policy Survey, what those look like, and how we're going to use those to create our community-wide legislative agenda for this upcoming legislative session. For those of you who don't know, the Federation is incredibly active in Olympia every year, both supporting the needs of our local Jewish agencies like Jewish Family Service and the Holocaust Center and many others, and also advocating on behalf of the community as a whole. And the Public Policy Survey being the main vehicle we use to figure out where we have consensus across our very diverse community. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested in learning about it. And this legislative session will be an absolutely unprecedented one, completely virtual. The legislature's never done it before, so we'll look forward to delving into that and what it means for advocacy for our community. So I want to lastly extend a big thank you to all the donors of the Federation who make programming like this possible. We truly appreciate your generous support. And if you all like what you see here today, we encourage or consider you to think about supporting the Federation and or other advocacy work. And with that, I want to introduce our speakers for this afternoon. We have Jessyn Farrell. Jessyn, she has a Juris Doctorate, and she's a leader in building consensus on transportation, housing, education, and environmental issues. She's a former 46th District State Representative and secured passage of legislation on oil by rail safety, affordable housing, and protections for pregnant workers. She sponsored legislation to increase Washington's minimum wage and establish universal portable benefits. She is now a senior vice president of Civic Ventures, where she leads key projects on housing, childcare, tax reform, and economic security. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jessyn. And we also have Rabbi Kahn. Rabbi Kahn is the executive director emeritus of the San Francisco-based Jewish Community Relations Council and consultant to Jewish communities nationwide on strengthening community relations, including the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle. He served at the San Francisco JCRC as their executive director for 27 years until retiring in 2016. In that capacity, he was engaged in formulating consensus-based education and advocacy efforts on issues of vital concern. He has written and spoken extensively on topical issues, including presidential elections and the Jewish community. Thank you so much for joining us today, Doug. And before I turn it over to our speakers who are going to share some opening remarks, Doug focusing more on the national scene and also the Jewish community and the vote of the Jewish community, and Jessyn focusing on the critical issues here in Washington state and what the results of some of those races might mean for our community. And so I wanted to just review the format real quickly. We're going to do a bit of a change from what we did on October 19th. Rather than having Jessyn and Doug give their opening remarks and then having some pre-prepared questions, which we do have, and hearing from all of you, we're going to mix it up and make it a little bit more organic. So we do have some pre-prepared questions. We also have questions from folks who submitted them in advance when they registered. Thank you, we got those. And if you all have questions for our panelists, we would encourage you to go ahead and use the Q&A function. Again, that's Q&A function, not the chat, and go ahead and put those in. And we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. And you can start putting them in as early as now or as soon as I turn it over to our panelists. And that way, we can kind of see where you all, our participants, are in terms of what areas you're most interested in hearing about from our experts here today. So with that, just one more huge thank you both to Jessyn and to Doug for being with us today. You're both really busy people who have a lot of demands on your time, and we so appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessyn to kick us off.
Okay, good afternoon. Thanks so much, Max, Doug. It's great here. It's great to be here again with you. And thank you to everyone who is joining us today and for all of your support of JFS. It's such an important organization in our community. So as Max said, I'm going to take just a little bit of time and give an overview of what happened at the state level. Doug will be talking about the national vote, especially with respect to Jews, and then we will also be answering a bunch of questions. So like I said, I'll focus on the state piece first. I mean, I think my broad takeaway is that this was not a change election in Washington state. Democrats have had what we call trifecta control of the governorship, the House, and the Senate for the last couple years. And that basically stayed the same. Jay Inslee, of course, won by a very wide margin. The House and Senate had some interesting races, but at the end of the day, maintained more or less the same number of seats that they had before. Most incumbents won. There were a couple of interesting races that I'll go into. And the real challenge is, are Democrats going to be able to deliver on these massive crises that we face? So I'm going to hit on all three of those topics. So the first piece is this, really Democrats have continued to solidify control in Washington state. Not very long ago, there was a very robust, vigorous Republican Party, particularly in the King County suburbs. And Democrats have near total control in King County and legislative districts. Even Pierce County, which has tended to look more purple from a distance, there were gains in the 28th district with Tawana Nobles, who ran for the Senate, beating Steve Oban. So, and then as I said earlier, we really continued to have kind of the same power differential that we've had in the last couple of cycles. So really, this was not a change election. And then even things like Kim Wyman, who is the one exception to statewide Democrats, having winning in all of our statewide races, except for Secretary of State. Kim Wyman ended up winning that. And of course, we have a long tradition of having Republican secretaries of state, and that did not change. So again, that kind of goes into my overall theme that this was not a really big change election here in the state. But I do want to point out a couple of nuances because those are very interesting. The 42nd district is where Bellingham is, but then also very historically conservative rural areas. And the 42nd has been a very difficult place for Democrats to win, but two House seats were won by Democrats. One was retained by a Democrat and one was a new seat won by a Democrat. So that's a little interesting. The 19th district, which is coastal Grays Harbor, which had been a Democratic stronghold since the 1930s all the way through 2016, now has lost its last two remaining Democrats, one in the House and one in the Senate. So that was a place where there was a change, and that's a reflection of a long ongoing shift, particularly in rural Washington, towards Republicans. There had been a time where there was a fairly healthy delegation in rural Washington, but that is now definitely in the past, except for one area in the north part of the Olympic Peninsula that continues to remain Democratic. The one thing I'll also say is in the state Senate, the numbers stayed essentially the same. Of course, I mentioned that one race in suburban Pierce County with Oban and Tawana Nobles. And then the loss of Dean Tacko in the 19th, which of course is rural, Grays Harbor, that really means that the Democratic caucus in the Senate is going to remain, is going to actually be more ideologically consistent. And that may be very interesting. Now, one other thing to note about the Senate is there's a very closely fought race in the 5th district between Mark Mullet, who's a centrist Democrat, and Ingrid Anderson, who is backed by progressive groups, particularly labor. That race is very, very close, is definitely in recount territory. And they're going to now, both sides are going to have to be doing ballot chasing, which is to say to find those ballots that, maybe had a missing signature or didn't match and match the ID. So they're going to be curing ballots and in recount territory. But again, that kind of fits into my thesis. This, Mark Mullet did not get just thrown out in the face of a progressive challenge. So I think that's interesting. And then a couple other things on incumbents. Frank Chopp, the longtime speaker, had, what seemed like a really vigorous challenger, but he, really won by a landslide. So I think that's interesting. The one place where a challenger did lose was in the 11th district, which is Tukwila and Renton. Dave Hackney beat Zach Hudgens, who had been there for 18 years. But that's really kind of the only place where there was this real resounding victory for a challenger. So I just think, again, Washington State's general vibe this election was, we, stick with the same. Now, the real challenge here, I think, is are Democrats going to be able to deliver on several major crises? Obviously, the COVID response is going to need to be at the state level still very robust and vigorous, and they can't take their eyes off that ball. But then the economic recovery that goes with it, we often talk about the budget issues, but there are a bunch of things that don't have a line item in the budget, the state budget, but that people are really feeling. So for example, the eviction moratorium and the general fear around paying rent and what you do with that entire ecosystem, rent, landlords, bankers, that's gonna have to get sorted out. And you can get out of Olympia with a balanced budget. And if you don't address an issue like that, that's gonna be an issue. Another thing is small businesses. Our small businesses are continuing to be in massive crisis. Are Democrats gonna be able to address that? Food insecurity. Again, you could hold the line in the budget on what is currently allocated for food security, but that's not going to be enough this year. So I think the real challenge for Democrats is, are they going to be able to really deliver on these big tectonic shifts that we have around the economy related to COVID? And then, of course, the climate crisis has not gone away, and it is only more urgent that we take action on it. And there continues to be this real racial justice crisis. And again, how is the state going to interplay on that? So while Washingtonians tended not to vote for a lot of change, the real question on my mind, and I think what we should be watching, is, are Democrats going to be able to deliver? And we certainly hope they do, because we have such significant challenges that we face. So that's a quick overview. Looking forward to questions, and I want to turn it over to Doug.
Thank you so much, Jessyn.
Thanks, Jessyn. That was terrific. I'm going to focus mainly on how different groups, particularly the Jews, voted in the election, understanding that the implications are, as Jessyn so eloquently laid out just now, in terms of what it all means. In 2016, the main national exit polls showed that 71% of the Jews voted for Hillary Clinton and 24% for Donald Trump. In 2020, the main national exit poll showed 68% of Jews voted for Joe Biden and 30% for Donald Trump, which would reflect a 6% increase of the Jewish vote for Donald Trump. By the way, Jews were 3% of the voters, according to the poll. Now, a caveat: we all know the pre-election polls were once again crazily off. We don't know how accurate the national exit polls are, because they've never had to do it like this. 2 out of every 3 voters in the country voted by mail. An exit poll usually is what happens on the day of the election, when somebody says how they had voted, and this is just a whole new ballgame. However, most objective observers think that this estimate is close to the mark. By the way, you all know that nationally, there's a 3% division at this point between the vote for Joe Biden and the vote for Donald Trump. In the state of Washington, it's a 20% differential, 59 to 39% when last I looked. And in King County, where I think most of you probably live, a 75 to 22% Biden versus Trump vote, or a difference of 53%, with 85% voter turnout in King County, which is staggeringly excellent in terms of voter response. A few other statistics before I return to the election through a Jewish lens. Nationally, Donald Trump increased his percentage from 8% of the African-American vote in 2016 to 12% in this election, from 28% of Latinos in 2016 to 32% this time, and from 27% among Asians to 31% this time. This is interesting to think, given people's sort of predisposition to assume that minorities would vote in overwhelming numbers for Joe Biden, to think that in each of these groups, including the Jewish community, the Jewish vote, there was this significant, not large ultimately, comparatively, but this significant increase in the vote. Focusing for this audience on the Jewish vote, a pre-election AJC survey, and I might have mentioned this in the pre-election discussion, found that 74% of Orthodox Jews expected to vote for Donald Trump and 18% for Joe Biden, meaning that the non-Orthodox vote is probably substantially more weighted than the 68% that comes out of the national poll for Joe Biden. Nationally, there were 4 issues that drove the vote for each candidate. For Trump supporters, it was economy and crime and safety. For Biden supporters, it was coronavirus/healthcare and racial justice. In many ways, these issues are the mirror image of each other: economy and coronavirus, crime and safety, and racial justice. We are talking about huge majorities deciding on the basis of these specific issues. Of course, in various cases, other issues motivate: gun control, abortion, immigration, climate change, foreign policy, but they are substantially down the list. The pre-election surveys of Jews indicated that Israel is not going to be a main consideration for most Jews this year, and that's largely due to a perception that both candidates are pro-Israel. That being said, I do think that there are more who go into the polls and have that in the back of their mind than surveys might indicate. However, anti-Semitism and white supremacy was an important voting issue for 80% of Jews, and among that 80%, among Jews, 2/3 felt that Biden was better able to address the challenges on anti-Semitism and white supremacy. A few other general comments from the national AP VoteCast exit poll. There was a less of a gender gap this time than 4 years ago. That goes against conventional wisdom, but it's not because Joe Biden performed worse with women. It's because, according to the poll, he performed better with men, closing the gap from 12 points in 2016 to, from 14 points in 2016 to, by the Democratic candidate to 12 points this time. By contrast, the pre-election survey of Jews showed a 22% gender gap, with 42% of Jewish men and 20% of Jewish women expecting to vote for Donald Trump. There were also other interesting shifts. Based on age compared to 4 years ago, Joe Biden did better than Hillary Clinton among 18 to 29-year-olds, 8% better, and 4% better among seniors. And as we all know, there continues to be a what kind of area you live in gap. 65% of urban voters voted for Biden. 65% of rural voters voted for Trump. 54% of suburbanites voted for Biden. 55% of small town voters voted for Trump. We've all seen the maps of red and blue in this country, and we know that that seems borne out by the picture that we're looking at. Among non-whites, interestingly, there was very little difference in who they voted for based on whether they had a college education, while among whites, there was approximately a 15% difference. That is, college-educated whites were 15% more likely to vote for Joe Biden than non-college educated whites. A few other notes. Jewish members of the new Congress. We don't know the full numbers yet. What we do know is that the 9 Jewish US senators, all of whom are Democrats. None of them was up for re-election. Of the 27 Jews of the House of Representatives, there were certainly some losses, such as Max Rose on Staten Island. There were some gains. Kathy Manning in North Carolina won election. She was the first woman chair of the Jewish Federations of North America, and I understand is still on their board. There will be new members of concern. I know of 3 for sure. Marjorie Greene ran unopposed in Georgia and is a fervent supporter of QAnon. Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina seems to be a devotee of Adolf Hitler. And Cori Bush of Missouri appears to be an advocate of the BDS movement, which is a cause of great concern as well. By the way, one of the things that we've talked about for years is that with Jews being a relatively small percentage of the population, it's always important to figure out how to multiply our impact. And that has historically meant greater Jewish involvement in elections. It's often meant greater Jewish turnout, but this year we had such a high level of turnout, I think our voting numbers are probably comparable to the rest of the population. At the same time, it was reported that 25 of the top donors to both campaigns, 15 of the 25 were Jewish. And that if 19% of the general public contributes to political campaigns, then 35% of Jews contribute to political campaigns. So again, there is that fascinating multiplier impact. Let me summarize with a few final thoughts about what this election means and what its implications are for the Jews. Voter turnout and the way the actual election day went, I think, are to be celebrated, even while there remain all sorts of issues on the front end and the back end, including concerns about voter suppression and the like. Secondly, the election was remarkably smooth, despite the grave concerns about COVID and how that would affect it. And I think that's an enormous credit to the election officials, Republican and Democrat, who exhibited and continue to exhibit extraordinary professionalism in their role. Thirdly, the level of division and animosity in our country is not going away. It is not also showing up just in statistics by virtue of the fact that one candidate has 75 million votes and the other has 71 million votes, or whatever the final numbers will ultimately be. It is also reflected in the fact that we are far more likely than ever to not just see the person who has different views from us as a political opponent, but rather as somebody who endangers our well-being by virtue of those attitudes. And there is a critical role for the Jewish community to play in helping to figure out how to turn down that temperature, because it's an attitude that also seeps sometimes into our own community. This is one reason why I'm so grateful that over the last few months, the Jewish Federation in Seattle has relaunched its JCRC with the outstanding professional and lay leadership, including you, Max, chairing this today. I'm deeply concerned about the volatility in our society with the economic uncertainty, the inflammatory rhetoric, the racial strife, and the growing tribalism, that the conditions are ripe for extremism to grow, including anti-Semitism, and that we have to continue to find a way within our own community to remain united to fight anti-Semitism, whether it's on the far left or the far right, and to not suck our energy in a way, or not to dissipate our energy by arguing so strenuously as which is worse. What's worse is that we're facing multiple fronts at the same time, and that we have an environment which is way too conducive for extremism to manifest itself. I worry about preserving our democratic institutions, which I think are critical for the long-term well-being of Jews in our country. I worry about the extent to which our center will hold. Final picture here. And I have tried to be as nonpartisan as possible, but the reality is I'm just telling it as I see it. So I think that, I was directed at JCRC in San Francisco for many years, and every year we took and continued to take non-Jewish leaders to Israel. Obviously with COVID, it's on hold. And it includes ethnic leaders, religious leaders, political officials, and it's one of the great kinds of programs that JCRCs can do. And you never know where someone will end up. And one of the people I had the privilege of taking to Israel 16 years ago was the district attorney of San Francisco, who is now the vice president-elect of the United States, Kamala Harris. So spending 10 days with her in Israel, I got a really good sense of her level of commitment, her smarts, her compassion, her empathy, her understanding of the issues on the ground in Israel. And I feel very confident saying that she will continue to remain a very strong friend. And relatedly, I think one can, and I'm not going to take the time to go into this right now, but I do think that Joe Biden has a long historical record on Israel, and at the same time, a long historical positive record. There are no doubt that issues that will arise that will come back to our community, such as when he decides it's time to try to re-enter an Iran deal, hopefully negotiating better terms. That was divisive within our community before. It may well be, again, the issues over settlements and annexation, which I'm sure that he will be very clear with the Israeli government about the position. And at the same time, I think he will try to build upon the peace treaties that have been recently created with the Gulf state, for which the Trump administration deserves real credit. No doubt he'll keep the embassy in Jerusalem. So I think it will be in all respects, I think it will be a moderate, sort of centrist approach to these issues. And I think the outcome of the election itself, which was by no means a victory for the progressive voices in the Democratic Party, actually has set up a situation where there's this yearning on the part of many Americans for a kind of more moderate, healing tone within our country. They've almost forced it by virtue of the way things have been set up, notwithstanding not yet knowing how things will come out in the Georgia runoff election. So that's my analysis on the, so much more to say, but I'm going to stop it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really informative, both of you. I've learned a lot already, was taking notes myself. And we've had quite a few questions come in. So I think some of them might be a little bit more quick. And I'm thinking, let's take a few audience questions and maybe spend like 2 minutes a piece or so or less, depending on how you folks feel they can be answered in a quality way. And then we'll move on to some kind of bigger questions, and I'll try and weave in some of the other questions audience members have had to those. So quickly, the first question that I want to put is to you, Jessyn. And so actually the two Washington State questions. One, curious about culp not conceding. What do you think that means, if anything? And then secondly, Washington State focused, if Jay Inslee were to get a position in the Biden administration, so maybe your thoughts on whether you think that's a likelihood, what impact do you think that would have in terms of the elevation of Denny Heck to governor?
Hey, these are great questions, and I'm going to apologize in advance because, like everything in 2020, I'm having, a little difficulty here with my internet. So hopefully I will stay on, but I know Doug can jump in very ably if something happens. So with respect to culp, I mean, in some ways that isn't surprising at all. He actually started creating some state notoriety by actually refusing to enforce gun laws. We passed some very strong gun protection and gun violence safety vote by voter initiative in Washington State 2 years ago, rather 4 years ago, 1639. And one of his claims to fame was that he was not going to enforce these laws. And, that's a real problem. We pass laws and we expect every single person to be following them, in particular our elected leaders. And so, in some ways, this kind of refusal to concede, obviously he's taking probably some cues from the president, but it doesn't surprise me. And, the numbers speak for themselves. So I suppose, this is a what is the sound of one hand clapping kind of situation. He can say it, but obviously in a state with such strong numbers in one way, there's just no real story for him. But like I said, he has done this before, so it doesn't surprise me. The second question, though, on, what's going to, the perennial musical chairs game in Washington State, we've had a lot of stability in many of our executive positions, King County exec, the governor. And if Jay Inslee were invited to go join the Biden administration, Denny Heck would become governor. The interesting thing to watch is the timing. If he became governor before May, which is when our filing week happens, late May, he would be on the ballot again in 2021 as governor if he chose to seek election in that case. And you could see a scenario where many other statewide Democrats who may have ambitions would jump in. Now, if it's after filing week of May of 21 of this coming year, he would not be on the ballot until 2022. So, so there are a lot of unknowns, but I think for those of you who are really interested in kind of the political gamesmanship and musical chairs, the thing to note is that date and when it happens, if it does.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Very interesting stuff happening here. Doug, next question is to you. You spoke a little bit about the Biden-Harris approach to U.S.-Israel relations. And one of the questions, we had gotten in advance was, thoughts about what your impact of this election might be on that relationship. And also with your personal experience, having taken Kamala to Israel with you on a trip with the JCRC, wanted to get your take in addition on a more specific question on her chief of staff's apparently hostile or could be characterized as hostile views towards Israel, and if you've heard anything about that.
Can you repeat the first part?
Yes, first part is just general take, which you've already touched on a bit, about the change in administration and how that might impact the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Got it. I think that there's not much I know really about the choice of Kamala Harris as chief of staff. I've read what probably others who are, steeped in this have read. I think it was when she was on MoveOn.org. There was involvement in organizing a boycott of public officials going to AIPAC or something. I will say that among Kamala Harris's most fervent supporters for years in San Francisco are many people who are top leaders of AIPAC in San Francisco. So I really don't think that her positions are going to move as a result of whoever she selects as chief of staff. In addition to the first that Kamala Harris represents, first woman, first African-American woman, first African-American vice president, first Indian-American vice president. There's another first, of course, as well, and we'll have the first Jewish second husband in Doug Emhoff. And Doug Emhoff, who is very proud of his Jewishness, but had never, of being Jewish, but had never been to Israel until Kamala took him to Israel. I think it was on an AIPAC sponsored or their America-Israel Education Fund trip, because she wanted to show him the Israel that she herself cares so deeply about. And I think that's a reflection of who she is. I think Joe Biden's friendship with Israel runs about as deep as you could possibly imagine. He tells it as being a reflection of being a 6-year-old boy sitting at his family dining table in 1948 and remembering his father saying, it is a slam dunk that the United States must recognize the new state of Israel, given what the Jewish people have experienced. And if you look at the reactions of Israeli officials who, maybe hesitated 24 hours before starting to send congratulations, he has deep and strong relationships across the board with Israeli politicians. As somebody who's been around, I think it's 47 years on the scene, he is truly somebody who's highly regarded in Israel. Now, of course, he was vice president during the Obama administration, and hopefully he will learn from some of the mistakes that were largely in optics and style, more than I think in substance. Though one could obviously argue on substantive grounds if they, depending on people's views on the Iran deal and the like. I think Joe Biden will learn from that, and I expect it to be very positive, and I also expect it to be, there will be times where there will be real tensions that may emerge. The likelihood is that Bibi Netanyahu, who is really an incredible survivalist, will have greater political threats in Israel from the right than from the left, which will mean that there will be times where it will be in his own interest to speak tough to the president of the United States, and that could create some gentle sparks. But I just don't think it will rise to the level of tension that existed in the Obama administration. And I think it's really interesting. One thing that is clear is that it wasn't that there weren't issues between the Trump administration and the Israeli government. It's that the Israeli government was actually pretty afraid to speak out publicly about it because they thought they were dealing with the president who was so unpredictable. This is quoted, that they were dealing with the president so unpredictable that they didn't want to set him up. So what they will have in Joe Biden is somebody who's not as unpredictable. And we will see, we will see how this will go, but I'm very optimistic, based on all the things that he has done to secure urgent funds for Iron Dome, to get the 10-year security deal signed between Israel and the United States, and on so many other levels. It's a deep personal and political relationship there.
Thank you. Really interesting. Things I hadn't considered myself. So thank you. Next question is to both of you. It's both one that we had prepared in advance and something that's come in a couple different ways from the audience, and that is about the runoff elections in Georgia. So as most of you know, there will be 2 runoff elections for seats in the U.S. Senate in Georgia. So we'd love to know, what are your thoughts on the candidates, the significance of the races, how the campaigns might be run, and the outcomes? What will that mean for our country? Just that little question.
Just that little question. I can jump in and start. I think one of the things that we need to be really careful about is our typical conventional wisdom is being upended, right? It was upended in this election. It was upended 4 years ago. So the things that I'm watching, for example, are there's just going to be boatloads of money that are poured into Georgia. There are things that we often think about an off-cycle election around turnout. Interestingly, though, it is possible that not having Trump at the top of the ticket will suppress or have a lower Republican vote. Although typically, again, the conventional wisdom is that, it's those off cycle elections that are typically more conservative. But I don't know that we can say that's true in the same way we used to be able to say that's true. And then I think, so I think the candidates are going to have to obviously figure out how to get their folks to the polls, and what do you do with all of this money? And I think the advantage that the Democrats may have, and again, I want to be really careful about conventional wisdom here, is all of the relational organizing work that's happened through Stacey Abrams' leadership, and the number of people that have been registered to vote in Georgia, and the relationships that have been built with those folks. That's, I think, where you really get the big wins, whether it is through faith communities and the relationships there, whether it is through the labor movement historically, which is not very strong in Georgia, so you don't really have that to lean into. And the faith community, of course, in Georgia is very diverse, so that I think will cut in a lot of different ways. But I think the way you get beyond the money is really by those relationships and using the personal persuasion. We're social creatures. We care about what the people around us think and believe, and using those and leveraging those. And I think the side that is going to be more successful at that is going to win. Now, the other thing I'll say, though, is, the broad attacks that were levied against Democrats was that they're bad on the economy, they're socialists, and the law and order, Democrats being soft on crime. And I would just say, kind of as a general observation, these are not new attacks. The Republican Party has been using these, sometimes with different words, over the last, since 1968. And so the real question is, if you're a candidate and you're going to get a series of attacks, how well are you able to frame up your position on the economy, your position on Black Lives Matter? That onus is on the candidate. For those of you who paid attention to some of the Democratic infighting, I really think at the end of the day, you still don't get away from retail politics. The candidate himself or herself is responsible for being able to frame up the story, and that success or lack thereof is the only way you're able to counteract any kind of attack, whatever it is. And again, that relationship piece. So that's what I'm going to be watching for.
I would, I'm not going to prognosticate, except to say I'm not going to go to Vegas and put money down on this election. But I do think there's a Jewish interest in both races. One is John Ossoff himself is Jewish, the candidate who's challenging David Perdue, the incumbent, and who came up just a little bit short, but so did Perdue in terms of getting a majority. So we've got that runoff. The other race, the Democratic candidate is Reverend Raphael Warnock, who I don't know much about, but he is the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was Martin Luther King's church. And this is shaping up, I fear, to include a Black Jewish component that I worry about. And that is that in 2019, Reverend Warnock participated in a delegation that went to Israel, Palestine. I think it was under the aegis of the Council of Churches. And they published a sort of a statement after the trip to Israel, Palestine, that supports the two-state solution, while the bulk of the statement is a very harsh criticism of Israeli occupation, is the term they use in the letter, of the Palestinians, and has some language in it that is going to be resulting in a back and forth over Raphael Warnock within the Jewish community, specifically talking about policies that are reminiscent of South African apartheid and calling on a return of the refugees. And there's other language as well. This is still somebody who has has put out a policy position on Israel that clearly recognizes Israel, that supports a two-state solution to safeguard Israel's peace and security side by side the Palestinians. But when I think about the kind of money that's going to be spent and the kind of positioning that's going to happen, I worry that this could be a flashpoint, a tension point for Black-Jewish relations. In the late 70s, I think it was, Andrew Young was the United States ambassador to the United Nations. And he had a meeting, my recollection is he had a meeting with Yasser Arafat that at that time was against American law. And the American Jewish community went apoplectic over that. And Andrew Young ultimately was forced to resign. And Andrew Young, who was a very powerful and important political figure in Atlanta and mayor of Atlanta and the like, it created a tremendous amount of resentment. So I hope this will be handled sensitively. I hope it won't emerge as a significant factor, but looking at it through the Jewish lens, each one of these races has a Jewish component in it that we will be keeping an eye on.
Very interesting. Thank you both. Lots to fill our time between now and when the runoff election happens. The next question is a big one, and that's about division. It's something that we have talked about in advance, and there have been a couple of questions that have come in as well. So, we saw that this election was divisive in the country, though Biden and Harris certainly won the popular vote by a significant margin. There were many folks, who voted for Trump and Pence. And Doug, in some of your remarks, talking about what those divisions look like: urban, rural, small community, suburban. It's there. And so, given that the current administration and the administration that's incoming represent really vastly different belief systems, leadership styles, policies, philosophies, really across the board, how do you think that we can and should move forward to create more unity together as Americans and as a Jewish community? And a couple components of that have come in from audience questions are, do you think in particular our two-party system tends to exacerbate this divisiveness? And then also, as you're talking about how should we move forward and how can we work together, do you think there are certain policies that can bring the Jewish community together to work together more effectively?
So I'll try the short answer for something that we should have 6 hours to discuss, because the reality is that on January 20th, assuming things continue in the direction that we know they're going to go in, we're not going to be out of the woods in terms of this level of division. I described it. I described the level of how high the temperature is, and I worry about it. And when I think of the two-party system, I remember having an argument, if you will, with a friendly argument with a group of doctoral scholars in foreign policy from Europe, who told me that they thought the two-party system was terrible and that the parliamentary system they have in Europe is better. And I said, what at that time, and we're talking about 15 years ago probably, I said what I like about the two-party system is that in the primaries, people appeal to their base and then they shift and they move toward the center. And what I worry about is that shift is not guaranteed anymore, that we're going to see that pivot toward the center. People are now much more focused on bringing out their base. Now, I will say, and again, I think this is an objective assessment, Joe Biden won the election because he pivoted more toward the center, whereas Donald Trump focused on energizing his principal base, and in the end came out a little bit short in terms of the mathematics. But looking at kind of that trend line and the responses to the election, I worry deeply about that. So the divisions are here to stay. I think we need adults in the room. I know that term has become so cliched, to stand up and to say we have to understand that this stress test that our democracy has undergone is real, and that we could pass a point where it would be very difficult to come back from the abyss. And we really have a lot of work to do as our society. But that has to be voices that are bipartisan, that has to come, from both of those areas. And I think in the Jewish community, we have a role to play both in terms of the internal challenges that these divisions cause within the Jewish community and in terms of the external. And it's why I'm such a, historic fan of the work of JCRC's, which as part of Federation in Seattle brings together those disparate voices and says there's so much we may not agree on, but there are so many things that we agree on, and we have to be able to find out where that common ground is, and where that common ground is, we need to be able to move together, whether it's on the issue of anti-Semitism, or it's on the issue of climate change, or it's on the issue of Israel, or it's on the issue of racial justice. We can still find common ground, but that is going to require a tremendously long period of rebuilding trust along the way, because there have been a lot of folks who have been seeking to pull us apart, and the work we have to do right now is tremendous. So, there's so much more to say, and that's just a tidbit.
And I'll just jump in and kind of build on something Doug just said around rebuilding trust. And I think that there are three really concrete things I would advise elected leaders to focus on. There are many things to focus on, but that trust piece. Number one, really figuring out how to better regulate the media as it relates to social media. I mean, there is no doubt that the rise of division has also been, in part, not fully, but in part because of the way information flows on social media. And we really have to modernize our view of what, social media is. Is it a utility, or is it really more, does it have more of an editorial function? And so that really has to get sorted out, and it's really, really important. The second thing is really dedicating ourselves to the project of making institutions work for everyone. We rely on institutions for a functioning democracy, but to the extent there are people who really feel disenfranchised in all of the different ways that that term means, those institutions lack legitimacy. So, whether it's public safety, whether it's our voting institutions, we need to really rededicate ourselves to making those institutions transparent, accountable, and work for folks. And then the other thing I would say is, we need to figure out some way of having a shared national project, whether it is national service, whether it is through, things like our public schools, but we are a big, diverse, difficult country. And I think that when we are able to have shared experiences, that really is, that helps, I think, help ourselves build that trust to be able to do big things together. As far as the divisiveness goes, I'm going to throw conventional wisdom to the wind a little bit on this one. For one thing, the macro data on the Biden election results are not very different from Obama in 2012, which we would have actually called a landslide. Obama won, I think, 330 electoral votes. Biden's on track to get more than 300. Their popular share percentage was very similar. So on the one hand, on the macro data, Biden won, and I think that there is this question mark, though, of, how do we have this kind of 51-48 divide, situation in our country, and what do we do about that? And so I think one place to look at, though, is where we have agreement on issues. One of the things I think is fascinating is you had a place like Florida vote for Republicans, both at the top of the ticket and on down, and with a supermajority vote in favor of a $15 an hour minimum wage and a ballot initiative. And that happens across the country. Alaska has voted for minimum wage. Oklahoma, there have been many so-called red states that have voted for Medicaid expansion. And so I think that when we focus on the parties, there is quite a bit of division, and certainly our rhetoric has ratcheted up. There is no doubt about that. Our partisan affiliation, those numbers have hardened. But when we look at issues, particularly on the economy, and this is actually why I think Biden won nationally, in part, he ran directly at kitchen table economic issues. And with so many people struggling on basic, kitchen table economic issues, whether it's how you pay for your kids' college education or retirement or housing stability, that to me is a place where we can actually find a center that's defined by helping the vast majority of people. So that's the thing that's on my mind that's really interesting. I think we need to lean into issues in a way that we don't always think about it. We lean into electoral politics by party, but I think that there are places where we really can find consensus.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. We had one final question that I wanted to ask that's both a reflection of comments that have come in from the audience, as well as a question that we had prepared in advance. And there's another great question that's going to come in. So I'm going to ask both, and I'm going to ask if each of you would choose one to answer. The first question is about the fragility of our democracy. And, amid much worry in advance of November 3rd about a free and fair election, we really saw our systems of supporting a free and fair election and supporting democracy in our country upholding quite well. Democrats and Republicans coming together at polling places, law enforcement protecting and supporting poll workers. However, there is this feeling of fragility. And so as a minority community whose safety and well-being in this country has been really intrinsically tied to the health of our democracy, what, if anything, do you think we should be doing to support it? And related to that is another area where really the safety of the Jewish community and our ability to thrive has really been helped, and that's through a strong separation of church and state. And so the other question is, with the division being drawn potentially between Congress and between the Supreme Court, how do you see our systems of democracy upholding that separation of church and state that has been so important to us, kind of playing out in the next couple of years? So one about health of democracy as a whole, and one about church and state.
Okay, I'll jump in and start with this one. So I think the fragility of our democracy is very real. And the things that I would like to see us really focus on, number one is income inequality, where we have people at the very top having sustained many, many, many massive income gains, and great swaths of working people not sharing in that. And that inherently destabilizes. The Great American Democratic Project is also about the Great American, economic equality project. And so that's something that I think we need to continue to work on and sort through. The second thing is combating extremism. I mean, obviously as Jews, we have a great interest in making sure, as Doug said the last time, that the center holds. And there are really specific policy issues, at the state level that we can be asking our elected leaders to be focusing on, whether it is Holocaust education or investing in the anti-bigotry programs that are done in schools and with law enforcement that ADL has been such a great leader on. So really focusing on gun violence prevention laws, those matter a lot. So really also focusing on extremism, because we need a kind of cultural and institutional center in some ways, recognizing that center can be a really fraught word. And then I think the third piece is we really do need to reckon with racial justice. And the Black Lives Matter movement and the social unrest over the last several months is obviously the culmination of decades and centuries. And it really behooves us to wrestle with this and get it right finally. Again, I am, a believer in the American experiment and our progress, but we have to really embrace this moment of fragility and the fear and the crisis, and really rebirth something that is new and more accountable and more transparent and more fair. And I really believe that we can do that.
Thank you.
I apologize in advance on this answer. And first of all, I agree completely with Jessyn's responses. Last several responses, I'm not sure if I disagree with any of them, but I want to put an exclamation point on those. But I apologize that I'm not going to really get to the church state one. That doesn't mean I don't believe it's a serious issue, but the other one is, to me, like, everything falls from it. The fragility of our democracy, the stress test that we've seen. And I think first I want to comment on a general important lesson and then something very specific. And that general lesson, I think, is we as Jews, probably more than anyone, know the danger of getting complacent about democracy, and we just can't afford to. When the Jewish community relations field was created in 1944, near the end of the Holocaust, one of the things we talked about was, back then, I wasn't there then, but over the decades, was the need for vigilance, the vigilance to ensure that we have healthy democratic protections. And there are many times where that was a yawner for people. It's like, what are you talking about? We're in the healthiest democracy in the world. We have to now know how quickly that can turn. And if we don't, that's going to be at our peril. And Jews will never be excused from being targeted. We will never be not on the target list, even if we're not first, second, or third in a particular instance. So I think that's an incredibly important lesson. And the personal piece I wanted to mention is, when I started in the field and went to my very first national Jewish Council for Public Affairs conference, it was in probably 1983. And the biggest issue on the agenda domestically was about depression in the Farm Belt, with people losing their family farms. And what was happening was neo-Nazi groups were coming in and exploiting that and trying to build support among these families that were feeling desperation. And the lesson that we were taught at that time that I never forgot was the danger of people being willing to overlook extremist views because they might agree with some other something that somebody holds dear. And what I have worried about increasingly over the last number of years is people's willingness to be overlookers, not just onlookers, not just bystanders, but overlookers. And I think there's a whole, I don't mean for this to focus on a specific individual or a specific political perspective, but where you adhere to a particular viewpoint and say, I don't really like this about the person, or that kind of behavior is inexcusable, or whatever. I think we have to help people understand what the implications are of overlooking dangerous behavior, including behavior that would tear at the fabric of our society, including behavior that would really test the ability of our democracy to hang on. We have a lot of work to do. And one of the things I often worry about, and I think about this because Jessyn mentioned the issue of Holocaust education, is, yesterday and today, really, the anniversary of Kristallnacht. And it dawns on me many times that we are now 75 years from the end of the Holocaust. And all the lessons that we've taught over all these years that we should derive from that horrific calamity. And what that means with it is that this stigma that attached to anti-Semitism that has existed for so long has increasingly worn off as we get further and further away from the Holocaust. And so there are so many lessons that we have to draw back upon from our own historical experience about the dangers of overlooking, about the dangers of extremism, about the dangers of not being vigilant, even when we think things are good. None of what I said was intended to or should be seen as an inference of drawing a comparison between our country and Nazi Germany. That wasn't my intent at all. It's simply to say that we have lessons to learn about the importance of making sure that we hold on and teach others what it means to own the responsibility of preserving our democracy.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. Really, really appreciate your insights and your expertise sharing that with us. Clearly, the work is not over. It never was, but there's a lot for all of us to do and many places where we can step in and engage. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We truly appreciate you spending your time. And again, to our donors who support the Federation and make programming like this possible. We really strive to provide programming that is engaging and unique and enriching. And so, with that, we will send out a follow-up survey to all of you afterwards, and we truly appreciate your feedback. It'll also pop up in the window when this meeting closes. So if you have any thoughts or feedback for us, and also questions that you were hoping to ask that we didn't get to today, we'll encourage you to put those in that function. And with that, I know we are over time, and so I want to be respectful of the time of our panelists and all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out and just say thank you again, everyone, so much. It's been a pleasure learning together this afternoon.